Good morning. This is lecture one for the site translation for court interpreters from Spanish into English. This is a continuation of the site translation for court interpreters from English into Spanish that you finished in the last module, in the last quarter. The only difference is that the renditions now are from Spanish into English, whereas the previous one was from English into Spanish. And therefore, new challenges are going to be on the table here, so to speak. And those challenges have to do with mainly comprehending the material that you are reading. Keep in mind that you're going to have to deliver documents that are real documents from Latin America, mainly from Mexico. And those documents have very formal vocabulary because they were written by attorneys, judges, and there is kind of a protocol with attorneys in Latin America that their material that they submit, any written document that is, must have really good high register vocabulary. In the U.S., usually the purpose of all these legal documents is to make it as simple as possible so everybody will understand it. In Latin America, the purpose is to make it the more complicated as possible so that you need an attorney to figure out what it says. And that's, of course, as you know from the previous course, it is complicated to just understand the material included in the site translation in a period of 2 minutes, because that's how long they are going to give you in your exam. And if you add to it the fact that the material itself, like it is in this case, includes vocabulary that it is at a very high register with terminology that is very, very technical, specifically very legal, and with structures that are quite convoluted, and with the fact that the grammatical structures, although they are equivalent in most cases, in many instances when dealing with legal documents, those structures do not necessarily match from Spanish into English. And by that I mean the word order has to be changed, and it may have to be changed dramatically, not just changing the order of the noun and the adjective. It's much more than that. And then if you add to it the fact that sentences in Spanish tend to be very long, because when you conjugate a verb in Spanish, you can always know what was the pronoun for that verb. If I say comparecí, you don't have to say yo comparecí. By saying comparecí, it's, as long as you said it at the beginning, if in the sentence continues, you're in line number 2 and it's the same sentence. And if you say presenté, everybody knows that it's yo presenté, clearly because of the conjugation of the verb. But in English, when you say appeared or submitted, if you do not put the pronoun, then you don't know what the pronoun is. It could be anything. So in English, the tendency is to have short sentences so that when you put the pronoun at the beginning, then that pronoun can be clearly identified as the pronoun for that sentence. If the sentence is too long and you, let's say 3-4 lines long, and you put a verb in line number 4, and the pronoun was in line number 1, then there is such a distance between the pronoun and that verb that it's not going to be a good sentence. It's not going to be clear. And therefore, what happens in English, because you have to put the pronoun again, then the sentence needs to be broken down into shorter sentences. So if I have an original sentence in English that is 3 lines long, it's possible that you can even make it better, particularly if you need to use a verb towards the end, by breaking that sentence into 2 sentences. Simply because when you use a verb towards the end of those 3-line sentence, you will need a pronoun because the pronoun was already at the beginning, and it is just very far already from where the second verb is used. So that is kind of called restructuring, and it just happens because of the fact that one main reason here is that the fact that in Spanish, conjugation of verbs give you immediately what the pronoun is, whereas in English it doesn't. So English in general has a tendency to have short sentences, and short doesn't mean just half a line, maybe two lines, 3 lines. And it really depends on the verb, right? If you're using too many verbs in that sentence and one is too far from the pronoun that was on line 1, for example, or that is on line 1, then you will have some difficulties in terms of conveying a message that is clear to the audience. So in that case, in English, you just break the sentence into 2. But in Spanish, you wouldn't have that difficulty, because when you hear the conjugation of the verb, you automatically know what the pronoun is. And although it was said at the beginning of line 1, when you see a verb in line 4 that is conjugated in Spanish, then it kind of reminds you what the pronoun is, because the conjugation of that verb will automatically tell you what the pronoun is. So you can see that all those challenges just by themselves tend to make this exercise of transferring from Spanish into English much more complex. It is, a kind of a personal opinion here. I think it's kind of ridiculous for you, for a candidate to be asked to transfer very convoluted legal terms from Spanish into English with complicated sentences and things of that nature, because in real life, this type of documents are not even done by the interpreting court, because these documents go to a translation department and then they do the translation, they do the necessary research, they have the time to restructure, and then that material is sent back to the either whoever ordered that translation, the DA or the public defender. It is true that sometimes a judge will ask the interpreter to render a document on the record simply because there is no time for the translation to take place. In which case, which is very unusual, you will ask for more than 2 minutes. So you wouldn't tell the judge, please give me 2 minutes to review this. Your Honor, we basically will say in a formal way, Your Honor, may the interpreter have sufficient time to review this, or maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and it's not the 2 minutes. So the fact that you have to transfer such a convoluted document from Spanish into English with such limited period of time makes this component of the exam the most difficult component, when in reality it's something we don't do in court. And that's kind of my concern. The site translations that we do in court are generally from English into Spanish. And if you have some from Spanish into English, probably will be some basic documentations, maybe in civil court, a divorce decree, maybe in immigration court, background check, maybe in criminal court, a letter from the wife of the defendant asking the judge to be easy on the position of sentence. And these are, so this lack of validation with the job itself creates, a problem, because the class you're taking right now, what you're learning right now, is specifically for your state exam. I doubt that you will ever in, I don't know how many years, I have 35 years interpreting, I've never seen a document like this. And perhaps one time I saw something a little bit complicated, but not as complicated as many of the documents that we're going to be doing here. So the interpreter, keep in mind, in real life, only does or mainly does translations or sight readings from English into Spanish. And those sight readings are always the same documents. They're not going to be new documents, right? And which documents I'm referring to? Well, the documents that you had in your misdemeanor class as well as in your felony course, those documents that are forms, advisement of rights, waiver and plea form, things of that nature is what you will be doing from English into Spanish. So you can see really that testing someone in sight translation from English into Spanish in that direction with material that it is related to the actual job should be sufficient to determine if you can do the work of an interpreter in a court of law. But for some reason, which I suspect it has to do with checking your formal understanding of legal terminology in Spanish and the equivalencies of those terms at a very high register, that might be the reason. They include that in the state examination. The fact that the state examination, in my view, is flawed in terms of asking you to do something like that does not necessarily mean that you will disregard completely that component of the state exam. And therefore, this class is being taught simply for the state examination, as it was in the case of the sight from English into Spanish. As I told you in the past, to be an interpreter, it would have been, to prepare you as an interpreter, instead of taking these two sight translation courses, I would have added courses that allow you to increase the speed and to become familiar with more trials and things that are more relevant to what you do in court than this type of material that really is completely irrelevant. So regardless of that, so keep that in mind. This is not something you're going to see in real life. It's specifically for state exam purposes. Okay, that's very, very important. If you are in the immigration program, this class may be a little bit more suitable because in immigration, they may ask for documentation that have to do with criminal background. There might be certain documents drafted by a Latin American attorney. There might be a divorce decree or whatever the case is. And in those cases, then it's much more formal. But in criminal court, that's, it doesn't happen often. It may happen in some civil cases, but not as complicated. The worst you can get, maybe is a divorce decree. So the material that we're going to see in this course is suitable for both state as well as federal exam. And I have to say that many of the people that took this class, along with the class for preparation for the federal exam, and they just recently took the exam, all the students that took this class and that class have passed the federal exam. So far, up to this point, we have 100% pass rate in this particular cycle. It was basically a cycle where they needed volunteers to take the test, and then the actual test is going to happen perhaps this month, at the end of the month or somewhere. So there will be more people taking. But I had about six students who took this kind of volunteer to make sure that the test was properly written and so on and so forth. They have to have a sample of test takers to determine that the test is follows the necessary protocol, guidelines, and requirements of international testing standards. And the best way to do that is just to invite people to take that during this period. And I had 6 students who participated in this period, in this test, and they all have passed. So the class is very suitable for the federal exam. And in regards to the state examination, most people that pass the state examination from our institution have taken this course. Without this course, you really have very, very a minimum chance of passing. So it is an important course, specifically to pass your state examination. So keep that in mind. The reason why I say this is because this is a difficult course, as I told you at the beginning. And sometimes students kind of lose motivation because they realize that this is something you will never do. It's like when you study for a written examination. In fact, the state exam written has this, I don't know why they always try to imitate SAT type of test, where they give you one word and they give you 4 options and they ask for synonyms, but these words have absolutely nothing to do with courtroom terminology. It's just general vocabulary, which really is completely useless. It just shows that you read a lot, but to be an interpreter, reading is important if you read pertinent material, and that would be reading material that has to do with crimes, with the law, and that type of thing, but not reading literature necessarily that deals with some other things that are outside the spectrum of legal terminology. So that's another thing. People, when they study for those type of tests, I understand that in the university level, although they are removing the SAT now because they realize it's not an indicator of anything, but the SAT and all those exams that they require in the universities, they are written that way. There's a reason why, because you're going to be reading a lot and you'll be taking many, many different courses. What they have done in the intern, this is traditionally what they do, they have taken that and put in the interpreting exam, and they have done that copying from the SAT, but they don't realize that an interpreter doesn't read. An interpreter doesn't need to know the meaning of a word in English necessarily. As long as you know the word in Spanish, that's it. It's just completely, in my view, unnecessary. And usually that happens because the people that actually write the exam, they want to follow a tradition, and even though it's wrong, they just follow that format. Nobody really has the guts to say, this is wrong, we're going to change it from now on and do it right. Because they're afraid that there might be some repercussions to this, or some issues could happen. Some people complain or whatever. So as I said before, because you're going to be taking your state exam, you're really stuck with studying terminology for the written that, it's just basically synonyms and antonyms of words. You could use that time much better if you, for example, have, the written is all in English to start with. So it would be much more suitable to have a question in English, a translation, a sentence, legal sentence, some of the material that you want to test in the site translation perhaps. Just have it and then give 4 different options from English into Spanish and Spanish into English and all that. That would be much more suitable and more helpful to identify who is a good candidate for the oral exam. But right now, the written exam doesn't mean anything. It's just a requirement. Let's put it that way. But it doesn't. You can pass the written exam without speaking Spanish. That's how bad it is. Okay, that's how bad it is. So that is one thing you have to deal with. And then the other thing you have to deal with is, in terms of, in my view, again, sections of the exam that are not validated by our job, this site translation, and actually both sides, from English into Spanish as well as Spanish into English, but more so this Spanish into English. Those are the 2 elements of the exam that should be completely revised. And in fact, if you look into the exam, even the consecutive should be revised, because in real life in court, the judge doesn't want the interpreter to, the judge wants the interpreter to render a segment that is short, not very long. So in the state examination, some segments up to 40 terms or so, the federal even more so. And that's not something we do. If we were to, as an interpreter, we'll allow the witness to speak for a long period of time, the judge is going to interrupt the witness because the judge has to make sure that the record is accurate, and the judge doesn't believe that you can remember such a long segment, even though you may have the skill to do that. But the exam, the state exam gives you up to 40, 45 terms long, those segments that we don't see. So you can see that even there, this is not validated. And if you want to just kind of complete the whole criticism of the exam, the simultaneous in the state exam is too slow. And when they tend to give you a lot of opening and closing arguments, which in reality, that's something that we don't do that often, instead of giving you a plea. So it's the exam is this, and the real life is this. And passing the exam doesn't necessarily mean that you can do the job. When you take a course, the reason why it works in the system right now is because most people have to take courses such as this one. And here we prepare you to work in the court system. So when you go and pass the exam and you work in the court system, you don't do a good job because of you passed that exam or the material that you were tested in the exam. You do a good job because of the material that you obtained from this course, from this program, such as, we took the 4 classes, the simultaneous, the consecutive technique, the misdemeanor, and the felony course. Those are the ones that really make you the interpreter. So technically, with those courses, you could interpret in court, except that you have to pass this examination. So don't be too discouraged, although at times you will find that the sites are very difficult and what you cannot comprehend what you're reading. And that's a terrible feeling, because if you are reading a document and you cannot necessarily comprehend it, how could you transfer that into English? And on top of that, imagine if the document is 3/4 of a page and you're given 2 minutes to read it, which is what happens in the state exam. So you need to study hard, because the way that I designed this course is I included all the possible legal expressions that may come out in any type of interpreting exam, not just the state exam, in any type of interpreting exam. So the best way to study this is to make sure that you understand the vocabulary that it is in each site translation, and you know the equivalent, and try to understand what it means. That helps a lot. And then sometimes some phrases that you understand the phrases in Spanish, what they mean, and the corresponding translation into the opposite language. So that's how you study this. Now, I don't want you to memorize the whole site. So if I give you a site that is 3/4 of a page long, I don't want you to memorize the site. I don't want you to memorize my rendition, because that site, you won't ever see it again. You go and take the exam, you're not going to get that site. But there might be words in that site that are suitable for the exam. And therefore, I can't disclose which words are high probability words. That wouldn't be ethical. But I can tell you that if you study all the terminology in that site, and particularly sometimes the phrases, as we studied in the misdemeanor and felony courses, then that should be sufficient to be properly prepared for both or for any interpreting exam. To make matters worse, in the state examination, I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but I know that in the past they would give you sometimes some versions of the exam, side readings from Spanish into English that are actually in the civil jurisdiction. It's another crazy thing, because to be able to do any document that is civil from Spanish into English, you need to have training in civil matters, right? And if they want you to be able to do that, then it will take forever for you to be properly prepared for the exam. Now, in our last course here, which is the next one you're going to be taking after this one, I go over all the different areas in civil, just the surface of those areas. Apparently, the documents that are given to students, if they are civil documents, are also kind of on the surface. So at least that is reasonable. And most of our students feel that they know that. They can do those documents. Now, I go over the surface, meaning that I don't know which documents, if they pick a document in civil, I don't know which subject matter they're going to be using in the document. But by going over all the possible areas, and going over just the basics of it, then you are prepared for it. So there is this class, okay, for the site from Spanish into English is this class, but plus the material that we're going to see in 2-3 lectures. We spent 3 days, 9 hours at least, maybe sometimes 12 hours in the last course. It takes about 40% of the course to go over that, and just for you to be ready for the exam, instead of using those 12 hours in something much more suitable to what you will be doing in court. Because the rationale behind offering civil is that interpreters sometimes will, when you're certified as a court interpreter, not a criminal court interpreter. And that means a court interpreter means that you will be able to, you're authorized, so to speak, to or certified to interpret civil as well as criminal matters. But of course, one could add, well, what about administrative hearing matters? Court interpreter means court interpreter, but you're not tested on that. So all these things that should be tested in the written are actually, they try to put it somewhere in the oral, and it's basically affects your chance of passing the exam. So that might be one of the reasons why fewer people pass the exam. If they were to give an exam that it is what you do in court on a daily basis, more people will pass, because there shouldn't be any surprises. That's what we do in court. That's it. Maybe the only surprises are at the level of a trial, because you don't know, like opening and closing, and maybe that's why they give you opening and closing arguments in the simultaneous. But the reality is that why would you want to test somebody in the opening and closing argument that applies only to one case, when that particular candidate is going to do 300 pleas in a month? So you want to make sure that he knows how to do the pleas, not a trial that may only happen from time to time. Or you can test in both. So, and by the way, the speed at which you're tested in simultaneous is just too slow compared to real life speed. So you can see that everything is, it's not that accurate in terms of what you have to do in court. So having said that, please do understand, or try to understand as much as possible what I'm going to be explaining. In order for me to teach this class, I have to go into a different level in terms of, we have to get into more complicated level that is much more associated with translation than interpretation. And we have to somehow learn certain protocol and certain principles, really, that apply to translation. And that's why it's called SIGHT, S-I-G-H-T, translation. It doesn't mean you're going to be translating written, but you're going to use translating principles in order to transfer that document verbally. So, any questions on anything before we begin with the class? We're going to meet again every Saturday. We don't have class on the 26th. Let me see if that has been indicated. No. So we will have class next week, which is the 19th. And then we don't have class on the 26th. That's the Thanksgiving weekend, and we don't have class Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. There is no class. Okay, so we're going to put the dates here so that you know on your menu. So week 1 will be today, which is November 12th. Week 2 will be November 19th. Week 3 will be 2 weeks from November 19th. And now I don't know what day that will be, probably the 2nd or the 3rd. And then week 4, I think it's the 3rd, December 3rd. And week 4 will be December 10th. The week of December 12th until the 19th, I will give you the final examination for this class, the oral one-on-one, plus you take the written during that period of time. And this class will be, you will receive your report card, just like a Christmas gift, so to speak, by December the 24th. All right? So keep in mind, if you have plans, no class on November 26th, Saturday, November 26th. All right, so since there are no questions, then we're going to begin with the class. The best way to understand how to deal with this class is to first comprehend a principle that we briefly discussed in the site translation from English into Spanish. And that is that when you have a word in English, any word, and you need to transfer that into Spanish, and this is just one word, okay, not a message, one word. Knowing what is the proper transfer of that word may require knowledge of context. So what I'm trying to tell you is that if this is the sentence, okay, and here's the location of that word, when you transfer that into Spanish, to be able to properly transfer that word, you're going to need to refer to the context. I call this, or I refer to these words, I always use this nomenclature, which you won't find in a book because they don't necessarily look at it this way. I have a different way of looking at this, which has been very helpful in many ways. So I want you to learn it. And I say that most of these words that we deal with from English into Spanish have a degree of stability, which really means, stability means that it gives you some certainty in terms of the transfer. When something's stable, then that word, when a word is stable, the word that you know for the translation that you know in Spanish for that word is going to work. And if you see more options in a dictionary, those options will probably be synonyms. If I tell you, for example, computer, that would maybe microphone, that's a pretty stable word because I don't need context to know that microphone is micrófono. If I tell you, for example, book, that's a pretty stable word because I don't need any context to know that book is libro. And chair, silla, and so on and so forth. So we have many words that are stable. An unstable word is a word where its meaning, the transfer of that word into Spanish, or the other way around, but let's look from English into Spanish here. It's dependent on context. If you see the word office, for example, by itself, you don't know what the translation of that word is. And the reason why you don't know the translation, you may think you know it, but you don't know it. The first thing that will come to your mind is oficina, clearly. But you have to be careful because if we are talking about a law office, then that word office is no longer oficina, but it might be despacho jurídico, estudio jurídico, bufete de abogados. If that word office is, the context of that word office refers to medical office, then it will be, no es oficina médica, es consultorio médico. If that word office refers to dental office, no es oficina odontológica, sino, you would say consultorio odontológico. And those are just examples of what stability refers to. A word that you see in English that transfers in different ways into Spanish depending on context. It's a word that we call it an unstable word. That instability, that level of, or that unstable word has different degrees, I should say. And that instability is actually very serious or not that serious. And it depends on the degree. In the example I just gave you, I can say that the word office, up to the point that we discuss it here, is an unstable word of the third degree. And unstable means put a U and third degree. This is more of a formal academic way of referring to it, but very helpful. Because imagine when you go to a dictionary right now, you see the word office and you see all these options. You don't know if they are synonyms or what. When you see, if you were to see this U with a 3, it means that this word office can be used in 3 different contexts, so the translations provided are not synonyms, and you need to know the context. So the reason why it's a third degree is because we saw that there is a possibility with law office, with medical office, and with dental office. Well, you can say medical and dental office seems to be the same. Well, we can still say it's a third degree because the word office by itself, when you're talking about an office that you have at home, is oficina. So you can see that you can say, okay, the word office is oficina if it's an office you have at home or in your job. It's consultorio if it is dental or medical. And it is bufete, estudio, despacho. Despacho y bufete is a little bit different, but you could use any of those as law office. I mean, despacho usually is for one attorney, whereas bufete is for a series of attorneys working together, or many attorneys working for that law firm. So having said this, we say that word office is really unstable and it has a degree of 3. This is one of the reasons why if you ask anybody who teaches interpreting, if you just ask for a single word, we tend to be very careful with that, the translation of a single word, I mean. We tend to be careful in providing that translation because we really need to know context. When I get emails from many students and I see just single words, those are the most difficult questions because the reason why I can transfer them, I can give you the transfer, is because I pretty much know where you got them from what practice, and therefore I know what the context is. But if you were to give me a list of words that are not, and I don't know the context, I wouldn't be able to answer them. And that's why whenever you ask a question about any vocabulary question, it has to be in context in most cases because of all this possibility of instability and the fact that a word is an unstable word, and we need to know context to provide you with the translation only for that particular context, because in a different context it may be a different translation. And this is true in the legal as well as in the non-legal. And when you look, for example, let me give you one that you would be really shocked because office maybe you already know, but let's look at bad, B-A-D. The thing that comes to your mind, the first thing that comes to your mind is malo, right? And that's the thing that you know. But this is a really, really unstable word. Because look at it in this context. He's badly injured. You wouldn't say malamente herido o lesionado. You will say gravemente lesionado. Gravemente lesionado. You may say herido as well, but that's more like wounded. If I say, for example, I had a bad pain, for example, you wouldn't say tengo un dolor malo. You wouldn't do that, right? So you would say un dolor intenso. Or if you want, you can say un dolor fuerte. If I say, for example, he has a bad cough, you wouldn't say una tos mala. That doesn't make any sense. Bad cough is just mucha tos. if you say, for example, this is a bad quality that I have. So this is a bad quality that I have. Whatever it is, it's okay. The transfer for this one cannot be este es un mal defecto. Quality in this case, in this context, first of all, we have to look at quality. It's calidad, right? But a bad quality, what do you mean by a bad quality? In this context, it refers more like un defecto in Spanish, right? But you wouldn't say este es un, estos son, or this, este es un malo defecto, sino que lo que diría, what we would say in Spanish is estos, and we do it in plural, son mis muchos defectos. In Spanish, we will have to use it in plural. If I say, for example, he has a bad temper, people say un mal temperamento. What does that mean, a mal temperamento? What we call in Spanish generally for this one is tiene mucho genio, es un mal genio, perdón, mal genio. So let me give you more. I mean, there are so many for this one. A bad check. He gave me a bad check. Me dio un cheque malo. ¿Cómo un cheque malo? What does that mean? Es un cheque sin fondos. You know, and on and on and on. I mean, I can give you many options, and most likely we can find even more possibilities where bad doesn't mean malo necessarily. So when we look at this, we have that, yes, bad is mal, okay, but badly injured is gravemente, so that's 1 degree of instability. Bad pain, intenso fuerte, that's a 2nd degree. Bad cough, mucha tos. This is bad, a bad quality, muchos defectos, that's another way. Bad temper, well, we use it as mal or malo, but really mal genio, so this is 5. And then here, bad check, it's going to be cheque sin fondo. So far we can say that the word bad has a degree of instability of 6. And the problem with this, when you go from English into Spanish, it is a problem. But it's much more so noted from Spanish into English. You may say, why? Okay, so if you're doing the cite from Spanish into English, you see, for example, él me dio un cheque sin fondos. So you may say a check without funds. But really what it is he gave me a bad check. So it's more idiomatic that way. You may be doing a side translation from Spanish into English, and says estaba gravemente herido. You may say gravely injured. Oh, excuse me, gravemente lesionado, gravely injured. When it really is badly injured. It's more idiomatic, right? Because when you start taking the word that sounds similar to the other language word, it probably works, but sometimes, generally it may work, but it may be not idiomatic because that's an old way of saying it, or a different register. He has if I say, for example, un dolor intenso, you may be tempted to say an intense pain instead of he has a bad pain. Mucha tos, you may be tempted to say he has he cough a lot. You see, you have to start restructuring because you don't know the equivalent. Well, mucha tos, it all it means is he has a bad cough. Tiene mucha tos. And, and so on and so forth. So this is true into both directions. So when you realize or you identify a level of instability in the English word, then you have to also know the transfer from Spanish into English. So when you create a flashcard for this, okay, so if you create a flashcard, you need to put all of the different options here, okay, whatever, 6, all the different options. And with examples. So that way you will be able to transfer this segment much, much more accurately and more idiomatic, particularly from Spanish into English. And one of the reasons why sometimes students transfer from English into Spanish into English, excuse me, and the sight sounds awkward is because they are using more the cognate, which might be a true cognate, but that cognate is not necessarily used in English as often as another expression. Intense pain, I mean, instead of bad pain, strong pain, you might say, for dolor fuerte, that's another option. By the way, this is not a unique transfer. You may have a transfer that can be said slightly different from Spanish into English. For example, dolor fuerte, you can say strong pain. You could also say bad pain. The key here is the English term into Spanish, that we don't want to use the words, but we want to use the corresponding expression in Spanish. To be able to do this, you have to read a lot, and this is important. And you do have to read a lot in terms of vocabulary that is suitable for court interpreters more than anything else. But you have to be not only read a lot, but the fluency in Spanish is to be such that you know that it makes no sense or it makes sense. I mean, tengo un dolor malo, that doesn't make sense for us. It may make sense for someone who doesn't have much formal training or knowledge in Spanish. And it sounds good for that person because that person is transferring from English into Spanish, and that person looks at the words and transfer the words. But when somebody who has really good knowledge of the Spanish language hears tengo un mal dolor, it just doesn't mean anything. To us, it doesn't mean anything. Now, if you know English, you know what she's trying to say, but remember, the defendants that you're interpreting for, supposedly they don't know English. So if you say, ¿tiene usted un mal dolor? ¿Qué es un mal dolor? No sé qué es un mal dolor. So you may want to say, okay, le duele mucho, maybe that's okay. Tiene un dolor intenso, un dolor fuerte, then I can understand that clearly. O me dio un cheque malo. ¿Qué es un cheque malo? Malo es alguien malo. El niño es muy malo. Pero un cheque malo, ¿cómo va a ser malo un cheque? Malo es una calidad, es un adjetivo que se refiere a comportamiento generalmente. El cheque no tiene comportamiento. Entonces un cheque malo no es correcto. Es un cheque sin fondos en español. So those details are important in any interpreting exam. Because the raters are very well versed in both languages, right? And they are unique individuals who speak both languages very well, but there's always one language that the rater has more knowledge of than the other language. This is common in interpreting. But overall, they speak both languages very, very well. So they are looking at those transfers, knowing, particularly when it goes into Spanish, they are looking at those transfers knowing that this word, like for example, a bad check, most people will say un cheque malo. Estuvo malo el cheque. ¿Cómo va a estar malo el cheque? ¿Qué comportamiento tiene el cheque? No está malo. Es un cheque sin fondos, o no tenía fondos el cheque. So for somebody who speaks good Spanish and is very well versed in the language, that cheque malo doesn't make much sense. So this is something we're going to be learning here, but unfortunately, we have to concentrate on the documents that are in the site. But occasionally, I'm going to tell you about some of this stability, lack of stability, and so on and so forth. Then we have another problem that deals with the stability, that it is very important, particularly for those taking the exams. This stability that we call it is a linguistic stability and instability, excuse me. So this instability is linguistic, but there is also instability jurisdictional. So instability is, if a term is unstable from a jurisdictional point of view, it refers that the term can mean one thing in civil, but it means something else in criminal. And we have that a lot. And the reason why we have that a lot is because in English, many of the legal terms that are used in both jurisdictions, where in Spanish we have a term for the civil jurisdiction and we have a term for the criminal jurisdiction. If you look at the word defendant, for example, that is used in both, in English, is used for both jurisdictions, civil and criminal. But in Spanish, if you look at criminal jurisdiction, it will be acusado o acusada, or even better, parte acusada, to eliminate gender, which is another issue that we have in the transfers. So it will be parte acusada, but if you do this in civil, the word defendant is parte demandada, among other ones. If you look at plaintiff, for example, you will see in criminal, you'll see parte querellante, maybe even parte acusadora. But in civil, when you look at plaintiff, it's parte demandante, among other ones. And I say among other ones because parte demandada could also be known as parte reo. There are other ways of saying it, and parte demandante could also be known as parte actora. There are many different terms for that. In Spanish, it's so rich from the point of view of legal terminology that not only do we have a separate term in civil and in criminal, we have separate terms. Not in English. English is the same term. But in Spanish, we have separate ones. But sometimes we have even synonyms that apply to certain cases. They're not always synonyms. Where legally there is a slightly difference between maybe parte reo y parte demandada, there might be a difference between parte actora y parte demandante for a very subtle difference. But we can, for our purposes, we can consider them to be synonyms. So jurisdiction is important. Have you ever wondered why, when you read in English a document, sometimes they say things such as criminal defendant? The reason why they do that is because since the word defendant is used both in the criminal and in the civil jurisdiction, they have to specify in what jurisdiction they're using it. So a criminal defendant, or a civil defendant, or a defendant in criminal court, or a defendant in civil court. For us in Spanish, a criminal defendant, we don't have to transfer criminal because we already know that if it's criminal, it's acusado or parte acusada. If I say, for example, in English, a defendant in criminal court, I don't have to say un acusado en el juzgado penal. It's redundant. All I have to say is un acusado because I understand that in English they have to put it that way so that they make the distinction between the jurisdictions. That's an example, a very good example of instability from the point of view of jurisdiction. They use complaint, for example. Complaint, you have many options in the criminal jurisdiction in Spanish. You can have pliego acusatorio, you could have acusación formal, which is kind of done here internally in the United States. There are many, many ones. And in civil, you also have escrito de demanda, for example, which is different. In Spanish, the translation is different for the same word in English. But in English, complaint is used in both jurisdictions. But in Spanish, when we say escrito de demanda, we know that we're in the civil jurisdiction. When we say acusación formal or pliego acusatorio, we know that or other ones, I just don't, there are other ones as well. Then we know that we are in the criminal jurisdiction. So in English, it's very common to see the criminal complaint. And students get very confused with that because most students have an obsession, and that is to transfer every single word. They think that accuracy means transferring every word that they see in English into Spanish. They have to find a word. And in reality, accuracy means to transfer the original message in English as accurately as possible into Spanish. And the transfer of that message into Spanish should not sound a message with Spanish words, but with English influence, which we call interference. There shouldn't be any interference from the English language in the transferring of that word. For example, in bad check, un cheque malo, I may be able to understand it, but it's very much, it wasn't filtered by the interpreter. There was a lot of interference. The interference went through like that. The interpreter can actually filter that interference. And the way the interpreter filters that, he says, no, wait a minute, in Spanish we don't say un cheque malo, we say un cheque sin fondos. Oh, wait a minute, we don't say for criminal complaint, we don't say acusación formal en la jurisdicción penal. We don't say that, because if it's acusación formal o pliego acusatorio, it has to be in la jurisdicción penal. To say acusación formal en la jurisdicción penal es como decir, es el caballo blanco es blanco. Doesn't make any sense. It's redundant, right? So what we do is that we interpreters act as filters. So those instabilities that are coming to us from English, when it goes into Spanish, we put our filter in Spanish so that we know exactly what should be the proper transfer. And the filter is basically nothing else than our knowledge. How do you learn those filters? Well, you don't learn those filters. You learn the language, and you learn what sounds idiomatically correct in that language. For example, I'm doing a site now from Spanish into English, and it happens to be a letter, okay? And the letter ends with the following thing. This is a legal letter, very formal, and it ends as follows in Spanish. Le saluda atentamente su más fiel y seguro servidor. It's a letter coming from Mexico. It's a perfectly correct structure or legal structure in Mexico. In other Latin American countries, they will only say le saluda atentamente. Mexico, they may add le saluda atentamente su más fiel y seguro servidor. Either one. Let's look at the structure from Mexico. You wouldn't transfer into English with the knowledge that you have of English. Because you live in the United States, you grew up in the United States. You wouldn't say your most faithful and servant salutes you attentively, because you know that that's not idiomatic. Neither would you say, let's now look at other countries in Latin America, le saluda atentamente. I attentively salute you. What's that? You know that it's incorrect because it's not idiomatic. But you do know that this is a letter, and here comes the context, right? So you can see that that phrase is very unstable, right? So with your knowledge of English and with context, and what's the context here? Well, you know it's a letter. And you know that's at the end of the letter. So with your filter, which is based on your knowledge of the English language, you know that at the end of the letter, you wouldn't end the letter in English like that. You can end the letter with yours truly, sincerely yours. And because you also know more about legal English, you know that if it is a request, which usually these letters is just a request from a person to a judge, you will end as respectfully submitted. So if it is a letter that is in Spanish, in which the person who wrote the letter is asking the judge for something, to rule in a certain way, and it ends by saying, le saluda atentamente su más fiel y seguro servidor. We know it's a letter. We know that translation word for word makes no sense. So we filter it, and we have many options now, because you can say yours truly, sincerely yours. I wouldn't say sincerely yours. It's too formal in Spanish to use sincerely yours, but yours truly is a little bit too formal as well. Well, what happens is that I also know that in legal English, when the letter contains a request to the court, then the letter is usually ended as respectfully submitted. So this is true. This is what we call, this is a reversible transfer, meaning that when you see le saluda atentamente, you say respectfully submitted, provided that the letter is asking the judge to do something. And when you go from English into Spanish and you see respectfully submitted, no es sometido, that, of course, that's a false cognate, respetuosamente. Or if you don't want to use the false cognate, it's presentado respetuoso. That doesn't make any sense in Spanish either. Es le saluda atentamente. That's a reversible match. And it's a reversible match under certain conditions. Condition number one, it has to be a letter, because submitted by itself could be presentar. Oh, wait a minute. Submitted verbally means lo dejo a su debida consideración. To submit a document es presentar un documento. To submit evidence es desahogar pruebas. So you can see now that in this particular example, when you see respectfully submitted, we know that that's a term that is included in the letter, asking where the court is being asked something. So the transfer into Spanish will be le saluda atentamente. If you want to transfer more like into a formal way of a document, if the document is going to go to Mexico, if you're reading a written translation, it goes to Mexico, or if you're interpreting from somebody from Mexico, then you will say le saluda atentamente su más fiel y seguro servidor, simply because you will see that Mexico has very, very good and accurate legal expressions. They're very, very careful in how they write. They're very, very careful attorneys, how they write. They are very good with legal expressions. Other countries have their own way, Colombia, Peru, Argentina, but there are, for some reason, as you go below Central America, and when I say Mexico, I also include some countries in Central America, there is a tendency to change things a little bit and to not to be as careful in the way you write documents. And there are some, they sound great, but they are a little bit different. But Mexico has very unique legal terms, very good legal terms, very well-researched legal terms. And they always have a term for everything that you hear in English. There's always a term, perhaps because of the proximity. So, and they deal a lot with legal documents between the U.S. and Mexico, so they always have a term. You go to other countries, if you go into another countries, might be certain terms that are used in legal terms that are used in other countries that don't necessarily have an equivalent in English. So we emphasize, of course, Mexico and Central America because the exam emphasizes those areas. But you have to also keep in mind that sometimes for a given term, given legal term or non-legal, but generally legal term, you may find a transfer for Mexico, a slightly different transfer for Colombia, Peru, España, Puerto Rico, Argentina. And that's what lacks in legal dictionaries. I do have to, on a side note here, I do have to tell you that I am writing a book with many attorneys from various countries in Latin America with the goal of creating a dictionary, but also explaining each of the procedures that take place in those countries, and with this idea of instability when the term is unstable and all that stuff. And in meeting with all these attorneys, we have an attorney from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, España, Argentina, I might be missing another one, Los Estados Unidos, of course, the US. So the idea is that all these attorneys get together, and first they have to find equivalences within those Latin American countries, and sometimes there are none. And then comes the American judge, the U.S. judge, who explains all this, and then they try to find equivalences, and this is how we come up with the translation, with the exact transfer. But those transfers, and it happens with slang a lot and with foul language. In one country means one thing, another country means another thing. Oh, we're also incorporating somebody from Venezuela because there are a lot of people coming from Venezuela as well, and we expect a lot of legal documents coming from Venezuela. So that type of dictionary is very helpful. I think so. That's why I'm writing it, because most dictionaries do not provide that. And if you wanted to know the term, how is this said? This term is said in Mexico. You may have to check one dictionary. How is it said in Colombia? Another dictionary. It's a nightmare, and you may not even know exactly where that term applies to context. So going back to our class, you'll find that when it comes to this subject matter, I kind of love to explain this because I think this is the thing, that the foundation that interpreters should have from day one. Their understanding, as well as translators, understanding of all these challenges. And not just, see, right now what they do is they write a translation, most translators, and they read it. Does it sound good or it doesn't sound good? What does that mean? What type of profession is that where you ask, does it sound good? It's like a doctor saying, hey, checking with another doctor, hey, does it look good or it doesn't look good? I mean, the surgery looks good or doesn't look good? Or somebody designing a plane, hey, this is my calculation. Does it look good or it doesn't look good? No, you have to understand, explain it a different way, right? You have to use your knowledge, professional jargon and knowledge of the profession so that people respect your profession. And this idea of understanding this from day one will solve so many problems with students who come into the interpretation field, because in their mind, all they think is that interpreting is transferring words, not messages. But once after a few classes and they understand that it's a message, then they have to understand that the messages are important simply because words, many of them, are unstable by nature. They come unstable. Dismiss, for example. Or why do I have to use sobreser? Can I use desestimar? No. Because desestimar is used as a translation for the verb to dismiss when you are dismissing an appeal. Desestimar en español es desestimar una apelación, desestimar un pedido, desestimar una solicitud. Sobreseer is just to put a stop to a case that has been formally filed, where the person was formally charged. Or can I use anular? I know everybody likes to use anular because sobreseer, unfortunately, is a word that is difficult to conjugate, sobreseído, sobreseyó, and all that stuff. But that's not really what it is. So we need to be accurate. Okay, the more accurate we are, the more uniform we all going to be. The more professional we will be, the better prepared we'll be for any exam, and the better respected we will be. Many interpreters complain that they are not respected in the court system and stuff like that, but when you really see the way they conduct themselves, you realize that maybe that's the way they're not respected. I have to say that 99% of the interpreters are very professional. I've seen throughout the years, they are eager to learn, but there are many, particularly lately, that they don't want to learn these filters. They don't want to learn. They just are very comfortable in their comfort zone, and they just don't want to learn anymore. And that's very sad. That really pulls back the profession, right? We should always be willing to learn, and learn means take seminars from different people. Different instructors can give you different perspective, different knowledge. You may, you read a lot. Different dictionaries give you different transfers. As long as the instructor also knows that this is specifically, in other words, as long as the instructor knows. He may not explain it this way, but as long as the instructor knows that there is an unstable term and that this is the proper, because of this context, this is the proper transfer, and particularly for this country, it's perfectly fine. So those filters that you are acquiring through training. That's why continuing education, our code of ethics clearly says that we must always take continuing education classes and seminars. There are many seminars that are offered by many associations. My students always say, "Oh, do you have any?" If you look at our list of continuing education activities, we just have one or two. We don't have a lot of continuing education because the way I look at it is, if the student has attended classes with me for almost a year, I need the student to go and see a different perspective. I don't want them, once they are professional interpreters, to continue coming to me to learn exactly, my perspective. They need to go to different speakers. They need to take different courses. And that's why I tend not to have too many continuing education activities, honestly. So having said that, let me answer the question. I believe there is a question. Well, before we answer the question, well, let me just do that. Let me answer a question, and then we're going to take our break. And then when we come back from the break, we're going to dwell into the material, and then we're going to see exactly what is actually going on in terms of how to do these sites. And occasionally when I do the site, I will mention this is an unstable term, this is the option, make sure so I teach you how to reason when you're reading that document, right? I am so against the 2 minutes that you're given to read the document in the state exam, because it's not enough time. If they were to give you more time, like 7-8 minutes, then you can really reason and create a much better rendition. But with 2 minutes, I cannot do magic here. I cannot. So what I have to do in this class is I have to teach you techniques to restructure, to move things around, that are identifiable by just the beginning of the word in the beginning of a sentence, or a certain word in here and there, and if then what word is after the comma, whether that requires restructuring or not, and so on and so forth. So I'm teaching you techniques. So instead of you designing the tool to take care of the issue, you're actually using the tools I'm giving you. But that's because you're only given 2 minutes in that exam. It's ridiculous. You should be given more time. In fact, what's ridiculous is that you're asked for such a complicated thing, to do such a complicated thing, which that's more, that type of documents in the sites are more suitable for translators. But regardless, if they were to give you maybe 6 minutes or 8 minutes, then you have the time to actually analyze it and then render, and you can use all these filters much better. But anyway, so I'm going to answer this question, and then we'll take our break. We'll take a break a little bit earlier than usual, and then we dwell into the site translations. The question from Kimberly is arraignment and indictment synonyms? No. Arraignment is a proceeding. Indictment is a document. So an arraignment is a proceeding where something occurs, as you already know. They read the complaint and enter a plea, and usually it's not guilty plea. And then the bail is set, and the pretrial hearing, and so on and so forth. And an indictment is a document that charges the defendant with the commission of a crime. So there are two different things. Okay, so having said that, we're going to take our break, and then when we come back, we'll get into please download the material for this class. You'll see it in the menu where it says download class manual. Please download the material and be ready for when we come back from the break. Okay, so let's take a 25-minute break. I have 9:15 now. Let's come back at 9:40, and then we'll go all the way until 11 o'clock. All right. So let's take a break now. Thank you very much. If you have a question, please feel free to ask.